If you ever bought the Fanatec steering wheel, the first thing you will have on your mind are the wheel settings. It can be quite difficult to understand them, so I just decided to make this video. And the first one you will come across is the sensitivity. But what exactly does it mean? So if you want to put it as simple as possible, it sets the sensitivity of the steering wheel to movement. So let's say we're driving a car with the maximum steering wheel rotation of 540 degrees in game. We have to adjust the steering wheel to 540 degrees in order to get as direct reaction as possible from the steering wheel itself and match in-game and real-life movements. Of course, you can adjust it to your own personal preference, but I do recommend the setting that you're gonna set to auto. Just a little tip, two things can actually go wrong here. First one, the car doesn't turn and you're getting too much understeer. Fix would be to increase the sensitivity until you're getting the same real-life to game reactions. Or, if you're having a lot of understeer, the problem is probably about turning the wheel too much. This makes the front tires lose grip and eventually you will get the same feeling like you're driving on ice. Let's say you're going in the straight line and you want to turn the wheel very quickly. It's not gonna work. The front tires will lose grip, so I think this could be the problem for a majority of the people that are watching this video. So please, if you're watching this, do not turn the wheel too much. But as I said before, I'm gonna be talking about that in my next future video. The next one on the list is force feedback, and it represents the mechanical resistance you can feel when turning the car. In a simple way, we can say that it replicates the feeling that would be obtained in a real car under the same conditions. So if you're going 150 kilometers per hour and the force feedback is set at 100, you will get the same force from the wheel like in an actual car that does 150. Of course, we cannot be 100% sure that it's the same feeling, but we can say that it kind of works in the same way. The setting varies 100 to 0 or 0 to 100. That would mean that if you reduce the settings to 50%, you will get the feeling of the car that is going 75 kilometers per hour, or kind of the same. Our recommendation would be to set it to 100 and fine-tune the in-game settings for the best possible feel. Now this one is a little tricky, but I'll try to explain it. So the natural damper will give you an additional damper which you can adjust from 100 to off. At 100 you will have the strongest dampening feeling which reacts to acceleration and the angle of your steering. If you want to turn it to off, your steering will have no additional damping, making it easy to turn the wheel. So the natural damper is a setting which can also help to reduce unwanted wheel oscillation. Think of it as a noise suppression when it comes to sound. So my recommendation would be to see how it feels about it. So your actual feel. And I have to say that I was used to getting this setting to about 5 to 10% range, but I just updated my software and the game with a couple of updates gave me the feeling that I'm not getting the most information as I could be. So I just updated it and eventually I'm using in range about 50 now. So this is for me that it kind of prevents the oscillation, but it still gives me the information that I want. So I think my recommendation would be to go into that 50 range, but all it comes down in the end to your personal preference. And another one that is quite tricky to understand, it's the natural friction. The natural friction setting is set to simulate the mechanical feel of the wheel-cooled steering components. So the higher the setting, the more resistance you will feel when rotating the wheel. This can enhance the feeling of driving vehicles without power steering or with very wide tires. So it just makes it kind of the same feeling like you're driving an older car, if you can kind of get the feeling. But this setting can also help to prevent oscillation. As with natural damper, I like to keep it as low as possible and keep it minimal at all times. Natural inertia is the setting that simulates additional weight of the steering axis. It can be helpful when using lighter wheels like the P1 or the McLaren GT3, but the natural inertia can also affect the natural friction setting, and it kind of makes the car feel less sticky on direction change. And now the force effect intensity, or FE, which is usually set to default at 100. So this parameter adjusts the overall intensity of the force effects and can make the effects smoother or sharp. depending on, of course, user preference. But this setting can be adjusted in the increments of 10, so it goes from 0 to 100, but you can only change it in the steps of 10. So going from 10, 20, 30, 50, all the way up to 100. So 100 is kind of the roughest and the sharpest option. It's so very, very direct, while 0 is being very smooth option. So let's say if you want to smoothen out the information and you don't really like the sharp feeling, you can set it to 0. If you like sharp information, set it to 100. I do recommend keeping it at default and using it like that. So tuning this parameter can help you refine a harsh or spiky force feedback signal in some games. But just as I said before, just try to keep it at 100 and eventually work at it like that. Force feedback interpolation, or INT. And it kind of works in a way that it filters and smoothens the incoming rough game force feedback signal and increases the refresh rate. For example, some games use a 60 Hz force feedback signal, which can be quite rough and noisy, like you're getting a rough feeling to your hands. But this can be fixed with the force feedback interpolation. Just by increasing the value, you will reduce the rough feeling and increase the smoothness of the signal. You can get the setting to about an off, which means that a lot of that information is going to be unfiltered in most of the games. To enable the interpolation, the value must be set to 1 to 20. So if you're just trying to filter all of the information and you think the information coming to you feel kind of rough, I think you will have a good feeling and you might even want to try to use this setting. And now let's talk about shock. This function represents the power of the shock vibration motors inside the Fanatec controller. The setting can be adjusted going from 100 to 0, which stands for off, in 10% steps. These vibration motors can be directly used by the game or the BLI function, which was called the ABS in older drivers. I like to keep this setting at default. I honestly never really found that changing the setting to like 50% changes something. So I like to just keep it at default at 100, and I think you're gonna be pretty good like that. And now let's talk about force, spring, and damper effects. So I'm just gonna start with this. You really need to have a look at these settings as a one setting. So they work as one setting, not three. So you have to change three, but they actually work as one. So I'm just gonna start with force. It pushes the wheel into a specific direction and works with the force feedback setting. So we can look at it from point of view that gives us kind of a multiplying effect, simultaneously working with in-game settings and the force feedback. So the recommendation would be to keep the setting at 100 and work with the in-game settings to get the right feeling. Also, you can also try slightly adjusting the settings where it just feels right for you. But just as I said before, you have to change the spring and the damper to get exactly the feeling that you're looking for. Spring setting does just that. It gets that feeling like you stand on the spring that tries to get you back in your starting position. Let's say the forces of the wheel that are trying to center it out as soon as possible. Of course, it depends what setting you're running, but my recommendation would be to keep it as low as possible. Something in about I would say a 10 to 30% range feels good in my personal opinion, but please keep in mind that all of these settings work together. And now let's talk about the damper setting. We covered most of this in the NDP section of the video, and you can just go up there in the NDP section. But the simplest explanation would be that it creates friction and dampens the info you're getting from the wheel. I always try to minimize those settings, but I really kind of like having a little bit of friction and a little bit of dampening to feel the car better. And now, probably the most interesting setting out there, brake level indicator. This feedback is only available on some pedals that have a small vibration motor in the pedals, such as Fanatec V3 pedals. A setting that has an extremely large impact on performance, and it really helps to get a better feel for a certain level of braking. For example, if you want to set it to 50%, we will get the vibration feel when reaching the braking level of 50%. So my personal recommendation is to set it to 50%. If you need to go to a point where You lock the brakes, adjust the setting to a point where it just feels better and you're not locking up. Let's say something like a 75 or maybe even 80%. And now this is probably the hardest settings that you can come across. The brake force, or the BRF. This setting will allow you to adjust the sensitivity of the load cell brake pedal. So let's say if the BRF is set to 100 or max, it will kind of translate into applying maximum pressure to get the maximum amount of signal. So you really need to push really hard in order to achieve 100% of the braking signal. Reducing the BRF to minimal will allow it's just gonna be a lot easier. Let's be honest, it's just gonna be a lot easier. So you can check the braking signal level in your driver on your PC, or you can just see it on your attached steering wheel LEDs. So the LEDs are gonna go flashing from left to right, and it pretty much goes kind of up and down motion. So this setting is also very interesting since it works closely with your pedal cylinder stiffness. So they work together. So your cylinder and the BRF work together. So no one will probably ever get this setting in the same way as someone else. If you're using the brakes performance kit, the setting might be even more difficult to get right. But here is how I do it. First, I find the 2 mark on the cylinder while I'm just trying to adjust my brake performance kit. Next thing, I open up the Fanatec software and get the 100% of the brakes. It's just like pushing much harder than you normally would. Then it's time to figure out what level of the BRF you like. So you can eventually go from 0 to 100, but I do recommend staying in the 35 to 50 range. Of course, you can go up and down depending on the car and the track, but this is kind of the zone that I like and I do recommend. And now, just to sum all of this up, these are my settings in the link down in the description, as well as Fanatec recommended settings. So sensitivity is always set to auto. This is my own personal preference. You can of course change it regarding the car, or if you're just running another game, you can readjust it yourself. The force feedback is pretty much at 100 and then readjusting it in game. FFS always set up to peak. Natural damper at about 50%. You can go from 30 to 100, but I think around 50 is okay. Natural friction, or NFR, is set to off, as well as the natural inertia. So I like to keep both of that settings at off because it just gives me the feeling that I'm in full control of the car. For SpeedDeck interpolation filter, I really like the smooth information. I mean, I like it kind of a rough feeling, but I also like the smoothing, kind of a smoothing effect. So I like to keep it at 11, something in between. Fey, I like to keep it at 100 because it just gives me the more information that I can receive. I like it. So I like all of the information out there that I'm getting from the wheel, as well as getting the force, or FOR, at 100. And then as I said before, readjusting it in game. So the spring and damper settings is something that you can really talk about, but I like the spring at about 50 and the damper feeling that I'm getting about 50 to about 100 range. But if you change the natural damper, you also have to change the damper effect, the strength. So they kind of work together, so you have to either change one of those or both of them. So it really depends on what you like and what you're looking for. Yeah, what you're really looking for. This is all personal preference. And as I said before, the brake force, or the BRF, really represents your own personal preference. So I use it at 40, but you can use it at a 50 or 100. It really depends what you like and eventually what you want to achieve, as well as with pretty much with the BLI, or brake level indicator. I like to keep it at 50 because it gives me an indication that my braking force is about 50%, and in some corners that's quite helpful. Guys, if you find this video helpful, please make sure that you smash that like button, and as always, thank you very much for watching this, and I'll catch you guys next time. Bye.